pars intermedia. So it turns out that if we look at a fetus, they don't just have an anterior pituitary and a posterior pituitary. They have a structure that's located between the anterior and the posterior that they call pars intermedia. Right? So this would be anterior. They're using different terms here. This would be posterior. Once this structure is finished forming, the pars intermedia actually merges with the anterior pituitary. So it's not a separate part, but I like to consider it a separate part just because it produces an interesting hormone. It produces a hormone, this area does, called melanocyte stimulating hormone. We call from anatomy that melanocytes are those cells in your skin that produce pigment. It turns out that in humans, MSH really isn't doing much with the control of pigment. In lower animals, it has a very important function in terms of regulating your pigment. So, I've been to the aquarium. They've had this display for years. They have some flatfish down there that in one aquarium, the sand is very light, and so all the fish are very light colored. In the other aquarium, the sand is very dark, and they're all very dark. You've seen this display? Some of you. And yet they're all the same species of fish. So you say, well, how can this be? Why? You got the dark ones, you got the light ones. It turns out those animals are adjusting their coloring to their environment so that they will be less obvious, and they do that by changing their levels of MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone. Again, not really an important role in humans in our skin color, but it does have that effect in animals. MSH does have a linkage to stimulating hunger in humans, or excuse me, suppressing hunger in humans. That is interesting. It's released as really a prohormone, and when it's split, this prohormone, think of a longer protein, when that is split, we get the MSH, and we also get beta endorphin. And we've talked a little bit about beta endorphin before, because beta endorphin is the body's own pain, to kill it. This area, part of the anterior pituitary that we can call the pars intermedia, produces these two hormones, MSH and beta endorphin. Now, posterior pituitary, the neurohypophysis. Yes?
Why do you call it a prohormone?
Because they're not released as individuals. They're released, so we don't have beta endorphin released and we have MSH released. Instead, they're joined together, then they're split. So we call it prohormone because it has to be changed before it's actually turned into a hormone. Two different hormones. So the posterior pituitary, this diagram is trying to show you that the posterior pituitary is connected to the hypothalamus by nerves. So there are axons that run from the hypothalamus down into the posterior pituitary through that infundibulum. The hormones that we find in the posterior pituitary haven't been produced in the posterior pituitary. Instead, they're produced in the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary, and then the hypothalamus can cause the release from the posterior pituitary. So unlike the anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary is not producing hormones, it's simply storing. One of these hormones is a hormone called antidiuretic hormone, abbreviated as ADH. If you give somebody a drug called a diuretic, what happens next? They end up running to the restroom because they got to pee, right? So a diuretic makes you urinate, then antidiuretic hormone must cause you to retain fluid. Right, and so I've shown a kidney there, not too exciting. We'll find out how it works a little later when we get to the urinary system. The antidiuretic hormone stimulates you to retain water. The hypothalamus has special receptors that are sensitive to the osmotic pressure of your plasma. So we call them osmoreceptors. If you are very dehydrated, let's say you just had a whole bunch of salty popcorn, the tonicity of the blood would go up, right? It would become hypertonic. That will stimulate the hypothalamus to release antidiuretic hormone, and antidiuretic hormone will stimulate your kidneys to retain water. On the other hand, if you just drank a whole bunch of water, the body says, whoa, do with all this water, right? Hypothalamus says, tonicity is dropping. Let's get rid of the fluid so it stops releasing that ADH and you'll tend to urinate more.
What's the purpose for holding in that water?
Remember, fluid balance is critical for all the cells of the body. And so the purpose is to make sure that we remain isotonic. Over spring break, some of you may have had a drug that inhibits antidiuretic hormone. That drug is called ethanol. Right? Ethyl alcohol. If you drink alcohol, the alcohol inhibits the release of ADH from the posterior pituitary, and as a result, you urinate more than you would normally be expected to urinate. As a consequence, when you wake up the next morning after having had too much to drink, very commonly feel dehydrated. You also may have a hangover, and part of the hangover is due to the dehydration that occurs. When I was in college, it didn't take me long to figure out, when I drank beer, I ended up urinating more than if I just drank like a soda, because alcohol inhibits the release of ADH. By the way, folks, the best cure for a hangover, don't drink so much. It took me quite a while in college to figure that out. But that really is the best cure. The second best would be to make sure before you go to bed, drink extra fluid so that you don't get so dehydrated. The other hormone that's released from the posterior pituitary, again produced by the hypothalamus, but released from the posterior pituitary, is the hormone oxytocin. Okay, oxytocin. Oxytocin is responsible for labor, so it causes the uterus to contract and expel the fetus. It's also responsible for something called milk letdown. When Nathan was a teenager, pretty commonly I'd come downstairs in the morning, I'd get my bowl of cereal out, put it on the table. I'd go to the refrigerator, open it up, and I'd find that Nathan had drunk all the milk, and that was milk letdown. So when a baby first suckles at its mother's breast, there may not be milk at the nipple. Instead, the suckling process stimulates the hypothalamus to release oxytocin, which causes special cells in the breast to contract and drop the milk down so that it's available for the baby. Oftentimes mothers say that they don't even have to have the suckling process, that just hearing their baby cry or even another baby cry will cause milk letdown. I remember when Nathan's mom would go off to the supermarket, I'd be taking care of Nathan, and she'd come back and say, oh, there was a baby crying in the next aisle at Safeway, and she didn't have milk letdown, right? So the milk let down simply because she heard the baby crying. In recent years, we found that there are other functions of oxytocin, and sometimes people are calling now oxytocin the tend and befriend hormone, because we know that it's linked to empathy, caring about other people. If you think about evolution for a few minutes, hopefully it would occur to you that when a baby is born and the mother is nursing that baby, it's a really good positive feedback system if when the baby nurses, the mother is releasing the oxytocin and feels closer and closer to that baby, right? So that it helps the baby and it helps the mother to feel like she needs to be there to comfort the baby. There is some evidence, still early in the research areas here, so early yet, but some evidence that autistic children may be lacking in oxytocin. And so that may be part of the reason that they're unable to relate to other members of society. There's also some evidence that the drug ecstasy works by stimulating oxytocin receptors in the brain and giving people the experience that they have with ecstasy.
I have a question.
Yes?
I heard that it's also used almost like an antidepressant.
I haven't heard that, but it wouldn't surprise me. So the question is our statement that maybe it's being used as an antidepressant. It wouldn't surprise me, right? So there's a feeling of all is well, if you will, when oxytocin's present. So that maybe I just haven't heard that. But it wouldn't surprise me. Yes, Dan?
I think it's water soluble. So is there any reason that it couldn't be like released into the water supply as biological peace spare?
You got me on that one. I don't know. I mean, I guess they could, right?
Like drop it over all the lakes?
There you go. Maybe. I think you'd have some objections from people, but nevertheless, that's a possibility. All right. Your thyroid. Recall from anatomy that your thyroid is located near the larynx. So here's a diagram pretty well showing it. Two large lobes, one on each side of the larynx. The thyroid produces two hormones. Actually, there's three. Another one that we'll get to in a minute, but two metabolic hormones that regulate metabolic rate. One of them is called thyroxine. This is the one that you typically hear of. You'll notice I also have it up there called T4. Another hormone that you may not have heard of is triiodothyronine, also called T3. It turns out that if we look at the production of these hormones, they're produced in the same manner, both of them. The thyroid actively transports iodine into the thyroid, where it combines with the amino acid tyrosine that's located on a long chain of a protein called thyroglobulin. Right? So we have thyroglobulin that's really just made up of tyrosine, this amino acid. And depending on whether the thyroid sticks 3 iodides on there or 2, you end up with either T3 or T4. And hopefully it wouldn't surprise you to learn that another name for thyroxine is tetraiodothyronine. Right? Tetra meaning 4. So the thyroid then has both of these hormones bound up to this large protein called thyroglobulin. And then when it is stimulated to release these hormones, which structure stimulates the thyroid to release those hormones? Anterior pituitary. That's what I forgot. We know there's thyroid stimulating hormone, right, from the anterior pituitary that can cause the release of T3 and T4. Once these hormones are in the blood, and we're going to mostly see talk about T4, but once T3 is also released, once they're in the blood, they can go to the target organs, right? Really most of your tissues of your body. And when they get to those target organs, we know that they act like a steroid, right? So T4 is actually carried by a protein. T3 is actually free floating, but T4 carried by a protein. Remember, we did this before. Release is able to pass through the cytoplasm, pass through the cell membrane, gets into the cytoplasm, where there's a binding protein that changes it into T3. Then it's transported into the nucleus and binds to another receptor protein that is able to then affect transcription. Right, so it changes metabolic rate by changing the rate of transcription inside the nucleus. So even though it's thyroxine that you've heard about, the active form really is T3, right, that causes these changes. Whoops, went back to the wrong one there. So before we go into the next hormone, it increases metabolic rate. It's a very powerful stimulator of metabolic rate, so that if we give a person or an animal extra thyroxine, we can double the metabolic rate. So if you're burning 2,000 calories a day, we can make your metabolic rate go up to 4,000 calories per day. On the other hand, if we remove your thyroid so that you can't produce T3 and T4, your metabolic rate will reduce to 1/2 normal. So it would go to 1,000 calories per day. So what we're really talking about, right, my math is the same as yours, is a 4-fold increase in metabolic rate by T3 and T4, right? So hugely able to increase metabolic rate. When I say, you can drive metabolic rate from 2,000 calories a day to 4,000, I know what you're thinking. That, oh, great way to lose weight, right? And early on, when they figured this out, they thought this would be great, right? We could have this, use this. The trouble is, it has many, many side effects. It causes palpitations in the heart, causes diarrhea, sleeplessness, all kinds of problems. So we can't use it for weight loss. Yes.
One of my grandmothers had her thyroid removed, like back in the 50s or 60s. Would you have to take
Synthroid, or right? So if the thyroid's been removed, the rest of their lives they're going to have some synthetic form of thyroxine to maintain the metabolic rate. Absolutely. We'll look at abnormalities in a minute.
They don't do that anymore.
Oh, they can remove the thyroid, but they typically do it with a radioactive iodine to remove it. But it's still a removal, whether it's surgically or radioactive iodine.
So it's prescribed for asthma?
Sorry?
I think this is prescribed for asthma.
Shouldn't be involved in asthma. Not related. Okay. Well, there's another hormone that comes from the thyroid, Thyrocalcitonin, that isn't involved in metabolic rate. Take a while, yes, but it's involved with calcium, right? Oftentimes people shorten this. They won't call it thyrocalcitonin. They'll just call it calcitonin. But I like to call it thyrocalcitonin for you to help you remember where it comes from, right? Thyrocalcitonin, of course, it comes from the thyroid gland. This hormone works to lower blood calcium level because it stimulates osteoblast activity. You remember anatomy? You learned about osteoblasts. What do those cells do? They make bone. So if you start stimulating osteoblasts to make bone, they're going to suck calcium in from the blood to increase the calcium in the bone. All right? So this hormone will lower blood calcium levels because it stimulates osteoblast activity. So some abnormalities. Hypothyroidism. If you don't have enough thyroxine coming from your thyroid, you're going to have a depressed metabolic rate. All right? If this occurs in an infant, we actually have a special name for it. I thought I made that so I can. We can call it cretinism. Not a very nice name, but it means that they actually they called it on the Isle of Crete. But at any rate, it was supposed to mean that you're not doing it right. Somebody calls you a cretin, they're not being nice to you. Infants that are lacking in thyroxine fail to develop normally. Not only do they fail to grow normally, but their brain doesn't develop normally. And so not only are they small, but their mental abilities are not what they should be.
How do they diagnose that in children?
So hang on. So the question is, how do they diagnose it? Hang on just a second. I'll come right back to it. If this happens in an adult, here would be a classic case of hypothyroidism in an adult. The person tends to gain weight. They tend to be sleepy. They're, for really unknown reasons, their voice tends to become quite hoarse. And they also develop a peculiar type of edema that's called mixed edema. So you see how puffy she looks. So they call this mixed edema. Mixed edema literally means slimy edema. So that if you feel the skin of these people and kind of move the skin a little bit, it feels like there's mucus or something under their skin. So, of course, the obvious treatment for this is thyroxine, right? Whether it's an infant or an adult. So the question was, how do they diagnose this? If the person has symptoms that would indicate whether it's an infant or an adult, the physician can order tests to check to see if the person has low thyroid levels. So pretty commonly, they'll check T3 and T4 levels. let's say that we have this infant that has a low T3 and T4 level. The next thing that the physician probably would want to check for is TSH levels. Not only can they check for TSH levels, they can also check the TH or TRH levels, thyrotropin releasing hormone. Right? Where'd that one come from? Hypothalamus. So they can actually check both levels. So, you know, if we think about what's occurring here, we know that the hypothalamus stimulates the anterior pituitary, which then stimulates the thyroid. The thyroid produces thyroxine, and thyroxine actually feeds back at both places. Okay? So it feeds back both to the hypothalamus, saying I'm producing adequate amounts of thyroxine, and it produces or feeds back to the anterior pituitary and makes the anterior pituitary less susceptible to the thyrotropin releasing hormone. So the physician's going to want to check both areas so that maybe the physician finds low T3 and T4 levels, but high levels of TSH. So what assumption can we then make? T3 and T4 are low, but TSH levels are high. Some problem with the thyroid, right? The thyroid's not functioning normally if that's the case, right? On the other hand, if T3, T4 levels were low and TSH levels were low, maybe we find that thyrotropin releasing hormone levels were elevated, right? So they can check to see where the problem is in this, what we call a hormone axis. All right, so treatment consists of giving synthetic thyroxine. An abnormality of the thyroid called goiter. So goiter means that the thyroid gland has enlarged. And there are numerous reasons why the thyroid gland can enlarge and the person can have goiter. Here is a really large thyroid, right? So when you go to the physician and have physical, very commonly the physician will feel your thyroid. You wouldn't have to do much feeling here, right? And this is pretty obvious. Goiter in numerous causes, but one type of goiter is something that we call endemic goiter. Okay? So one type of goiter would be endemic goiter. There's that word. What does endemic mean? In an area, right? So people sometimes say that malaria is endemic to tropical Africa. Right? So they find it in a particular geographical area. Very early on, they knew that there were certain places in the world where they expected to find goiter. And they saw these people developing really large thyroid. They didn't know why. They suspected that it could be infection. They didn't know what was going on. When they figured out that the thyroid required iodine in order to make T3 and T4, it gave them a really big hint that the real problem was not an infectious agent, but rather a lack of the nutrient iodine or iodide in the soil. Here in the United States, near the Great Lakes, there were outbreaks of goiter. And when they started looking at it, they found that iodine was missing in the food in that area. Because many, many thousands of years ago, the glaciers came through that area of the Great Lakes and removed the stratum of soil that had iodine in it. Once they figured out that it was a lack of iodine, of course, they needed to do experiments, so they took 2 all-girls schools, young grade schools. One group of students received iodine with their food. The other students did not. And in very short order, they discontinued the study because they saw that the students receiving iodine did not develop goiters. The other young girls were all developing goiters. Since that time, they have put iodine in your salt so that when you go to the store and buy salt, what does it say? Iodines. Now, we live near the ocean. We get plenty of iodine from the seafood that we eat that's here. It's not really a problem for us, but in some parts of the world, in some parts of the country, it's still a problem in their lack of iodine. Even once they treat these people with giving them adequate amounts of iodine, the thyroid does not go back to its original size. So this woman would be stuck with this goiter unless she decided to have it reduced. The common way to reduce it these days is to give the person radioactive iodine. I know it sounds very scary, but it turns out that only the thyroid actively transports iodine. The thyroid takes up the radioactive iodine, kills those cells, and the thyroid will shrink. So if you had a person that had hypothyroidism due to a lack of iodine, what do you think would, and we went and did blood tests, we find low T3, T4, what do you think the TSH levels would look like? Really high, right? So, right, this is just negative feedback, folks. You wake up on a cold morning, and you go down and you turn up your heater, you go back up to reading or whatever you're doing, and a little while later, boy, it's still cold in here. You go down and turn the heater up some more. But if your furnace is broken, you'll just keep turning up the heater, right? In the case of people that have endemic goiter, the thyroid is not getting enough iodine, it doesn't matter that the anterior pituitary keeps telling the thyroid, hey, get bigger, get faster, we need more thyroxine. No more thyroxine comes, it just continues to stimulate so that thyroid continues to grow. Okay. The opposite of hypothyroidism would be hyperthyroidism. So that if you receive too much thyroxine, metabolic rate will go up, you're going to tend to lose weight, you'll be very nervous, you'll have a hard time sleeping, you'll have heart palpitations, you develop diarrhea, all kinds of other problems with hyperthyroidism. One of the side effects of hyperthyroidism that's relatively common is something called exophthalmia. Exophthalmia. So here's a woman that has very prominent exophthalmia.
How do you spell that?
There's the word for you. Okay? Meaning the eyes are sticking out. Let's see. Betty Davis had this condition. Marty Feldman had this condition. Don Knotts had this condition. It turns out that when you have excessive amounts of TSH being released, the excessive amounts of TSH not only stimulates the thyroid, but for really unknown reasons causes increased deposition of connective tissue behind the eye and causes the eye to protrude. When you look at people with exophthalmia, the thing that's very noticeable is you can see sclera above the pupil. Right? When you normally look at a person, you can't see the sclera. If you see that, it looks like it's startling, right? All of a sudden you start seeing the sclera above. So that's a classic example is when you can see sclera above the pupil. There are numerous causes of hyperthyroidism. One of them is a condition called Graves' disease. Graves' disease is an autoimmune disease. We're going to talk about another autoimmune disease in a few minutes, diabetes. But in Graves' disease, the antibodies that are being formed to whatever the stimulus was to this autoimmune disease not only are reacting to whatever the antigen was, but act like TSH. And so they attach to the thyroid gland and stimulate increased metabolic rate in the person's body. Your parathyroid glands. Parathyroid glands. Para means next to. Parasympathetic meant it was next to the sympathetic. Right? So para means next to. The parathyroid glands are next to the thyroid. Typically there are 4 of these. This is a dorsal view, and they didn't do a great job of showing it, but if you look closely, there's one parathyroid gland, here's another, there's one there, there's one over there. So these are on the dorsal surface of the thyroid. And the parathyroid glands produce a hormone called parathyroid hormone, but oftentimes it's called parathormone or PTH. Okay? So parathyroid hormone, parathormone, PTH, all the same thing. So a hormone produced by the parathyroid glands. This hormone has the opposite effect as thyrocalcitonin. So thyrocalcitonin, recall, lowered blood calcium levels. Parathyroid hormone will raise blood calcium levels, and it raises blood calcium levels because it stimulates osteoclasts, right? It stimulates the osteoclasts. Remember osteoclasts in anatomy? Bone eaters, right? The bone eaters. We've already talked a little bit about calcium, right? We talked about calcium being important at the synapse. Turns out we'll find that calcium is important for muscle contractions. Calcium is going to be important for blood coagulation. So we actually produce two different hormones to regulate our blood calcium levels. Thyrocalcitonin, parathyroid hormone, so that we can keep the blood calcium levels where they need to be. Parathyroid hormone does something else. It stimulates your kidneys to change vitamin D into a really long word. No, into a hormone that has a really long name. Dihydroxycholecalciferol. I don't care that you know that. Right? Dihydroxycholecalciferol would be great for Scrabble, though, wouldn't it? Dihydroxycholecalciferol is very commonly called calcitriol. Okay? It's called calcitriol. This hormone, so we're going to change vitamin D in our kidneys into calcitriol, and calcitriol stimulates the kidneys and intestines to absorb calcium. Do you see that we're talking about the same effect? Raised blood calcium levels. Increased calcium absorption from the intestines, increased calcium absorption from the kidneys. Okay? Under the influence of calcitriol. A year or two ago, I read an alarming statistic. The statistic said that about 3/4 of the U.S. adult population is deficient in vitamin D. That's huge. So 3/4 of the adult population deficient in vitamin D. Really what's happened is we've done such a good job of teaching people about melanoma and the dangers of ultraviolet light that we're now not getting enough normal ultraviolet light to stimulate the production of vitamin D that we need in our body. Vitamin D, critical for stimulating bone growth, and it also acts like, in a sense, almost like a hormone in that it plays a role in other cell metabolic machinery. So at some point, if you're in for a physical, you might ask your doctor, gee, could you run a vitamin D test on me? Or, alternatively, about 15 minutes of one arm being exposed to the sun a day without sunscreen will raise your vitamin D levels. And
You said that it changes vitamin D in kidneys.
so as the vitamin D that's in your blood travels through the kidneys, it's changed into calcitriol.
But then it stimulates it in both the kidney and the intestines.
But then calcitriol causes calcium retention in both the kidneys and intestines.
Okay, but it only is...
Changes this, it causes this transformation, if you will, in the kidneys.
Okay, thank you. Also, can there be too much of this? Could you, if you take plenty of vitamin D and plenty of calcium, could you get bone spurs? Or
I don't know about bone spurs, but most fat-soluble vitamins, you can get too much. I don't know the symptoms of excess vitamin D. I'd have to go look it up. But you can with fat-soluble vitamins, it can happen. Your adrenal glands. So we know that the adrenal glands produce, well, let's first, before we talk about what they produce, remember from anatomy, two different separate parts, right? The outside, called the adrenal cortex, inside adrenal medulla. Adrenal medulla, we know, produces epinephrine and norepinephrine. Right? Mostly epinephrine, but lesser extent norepinephrine. So we don't really need to go back to the adrenal medulla. We need to look at the adrenal cortex, the outside of the adrenal glands. And it turns out there are 3 different groups of hormones that are produced by the adrenal cortex. One of these groups of hormones are called the mineralocorticoids. Mineralocorticoids. So they're going to affect the minerals. They come from the cortex, and they're a steroid. Right? That's why they named them mineralocorticoids. The major mineralocorticoid is a hormone called aldosterone. Okay? The major one is a hormone called aldosterone. If your kidneys become ischemic, meaning your kidneys have low blood flow, okay? So if your kidneys become ischemic, the kidneys are going to produce an enzyme called renin. Renin will cause the formation of a hormone called angiotensin. Okay? So this enzyme renin causes formation of this hormone called angiotensin. When we get to the cardiovascular system and the urinary system, we're going to look at this mechanism in a lot more detail. But for now, we just need to know that renin causes the formation of this hormone called angiotensin. Angiotensin stimulates the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone. Aldosterone stimulates the kidneys to retain sodium. And when sodium is retained, water is retained. Let's see if we can close this loop. All right, so we don't want to leave this loop open-ended here. So we know the problem is we have an ischemic kidney. It releases renin. Renin causes the formation of angiotensin. Angiotensin stimulates the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone. Okay. Aldosterone stimulates the kidneys to increase retention of sodium and water. How are we going to close this loop? Do you see how the loop closes? If I retain sodium and water, that's going to lead to an increase in blood volume, and that will relieve the ischemic kidney. Right? That takes care of the problem that we have. Okay? So aldosterone is a mineralocorticoid because it stimulates the retention of sodium, and its release is controlled by the kidney, even though it comes from the adrenal cortex.
So the first condition is low blood flow?
To the kidney.
Okay.
Okay? So if you have low blood flow to the kidney, ischemia, right? So ischemic kidneys, that's going to start this process.
And then the end result is
Increased blood
volume.
Increased blood volume, which will cause increased blood flow to the kidney. What's that? No. So the blood volume increases because when you retain sodium, water will be reabsorbed by osmosis. And where does it go? And so as you retain more water, blood volume goes up.
So antidiuretic hormone would go up in response to this.
Antidiuretic hormone would also be increasing if the blood became hypotonic. But there's no, right? ADH is linked to tonicity, not to blood flow. Little different mechanism.
If you're keeping in more water, isn't that going to change
But sodium and water. Right? Sodium chloride and water.
So they're in, they keep in proportion.
Your glucocorticoids. Okay? Hormones that are steroids that come from the cortex that affect blood glucose level. It turns out that you have a number of glucocorticoids The one that's most important is this cortisol. There's also cortisone, corticosterone, but 95% of the activity is this hormone, cortisol. You know cortisol by another name. It's also commonly called hydrocortisone. All right, now why do you know about hydrocortisone? What? Anti-inflammatory stuff, right? So you got a rash, and what do? You went down to the drugstore and they said, here, buy this hydrocortisone ointment, rub it on there, and the rash will go away. So that's one of the things that cortisol does, is anti-inflammatory, because it stabilizes lysosomes and constricts blood vessels. Okay? So that's why you used it there. Really what we're talking about is that we want to prepare the body for stress. Right? So you're experiencing a stressful time, you're taking human physiology, right? And so as a consequence, when you're exposed to stress, you're going to increase the release of cortisol from your adrenal cortex. Remember, that's really under the regulation of the anterior pituitary and hypothalamus. Remember, ACTH, adrenal corticotropic hormone, right? And ACTH releasing hormone in the hypothalamus. When you release cortisol, it's going to mobilize the nutrients. It's going to release nutrients into your bloodstream so that whatever stress you're involved in, you have nutrients so that the tissues can handle that stress. So you're going to increase the release of glucose into the blood. That's why they call it a glucocorticoid. Additionally, you're going to increase the release of fats into the bloodstream. You increase the release of amino acids into the bloodstream. It decreases protein synthesis. Okay? This hormone actually decreases protein synthesis, which seems kind of counterintuitive, but the idea being generally decrease protein synthesis so that you can have whatever protein synthesis you need in an area that's being stressed. Stabilizes lysosomes, constricts blood vessels, I mentioned already. So this drug is released normally when you're undergoing stress. Synthetic cortisols have been around for a long time, so you can go buy hydrocortisone ointment. A related drug is something called prednisone. These are wonder drugs, people, if you're having lots of inflammation. I think I maybe mentioned poison oak at the beginning of the class. I get horrible poison oak when I'm exposed. The last time I was exposed was because our dog got into poison oak. I didn't realize the dog was into poison oak. I know poison oak, let me tell you, all stages of it. I had horrible poison oak. Went to doctors on duty, waited about 3 hours, but eventually got into the waiting room there, or the exam room. The doctor walked in, took one look at me. My eyes were almost completely closed from the poison oak. I was red everywhere. The doctor looked at me and said, poison oak? I said, yes. They just turned around, went back, and they got the syringe, came back, and gave me a nice shot of prednisone, and gave me oral prednisone to take home. A wonder drug, right? I mean, it was amazing. The problem arises is if you continue to take the drug over a long period of time, because if you constantly release this drug into the bloodstream, you're going to start to have long-term effects, so long-term constriction of blood vessels, long-term problems adequately really regulating electrolytes, long-term problems with the flowing of triglycerides in the bloodstream. Not uncommon for people that have had long-term use of prednisone, cortisol drugs, who, for instance, end up falling and breaking their hip because the blood vessels have been constricted so badly they do not have adequate stimulus of blood flow to the bones. Baseball season's just starting, right? Classic thing to do for a pitcher. The pitcher keeps complaining of problems with tendons of the elbow, perhaps the shoulder, but commonly the elbow. The pitcher's getting paid $6 million a year or some horrible, right, large amount of money, and say, gosh, we really need you to pitch. You've got to pitch. And so they go see the trainer, and the trainer slips a little needle in there, gives them a little shot of prednisone, the inflammation goes away. Gosh, they're good as new. They continue to do that a number of times. The pitcher comes out, throws the ball, and snap! The tendon comes right off the elbow because it decreases protein synthesis and causes constriction of blood vessels. Now the pitcher has to go in for tendon repair, right? So short-term use, quite effective. Long-term use, not such a good idea.
Unless you have to, you know, sometimes if you have a very...
Oh yeah, sometimes it's just critical, right? So the person has some horrible rheumatoid arthritis or lupus or you know, it has to be done sometimes. It's better than, but they have to weigh this, right? So you always weigh the consequences versus the reward, if you will. The third group of hormones that comes from the adrenal cortex are androgens. Androgens are male sex hormones. Male sex hormones. They don't have much of an effect in males because males produce adequate amounts of male sex hormones, testosterone, of course the obvious one from the testes. In women, the androgens are important. They help to stimulate muscle growth, the growth of hair. They also stimulate libido in women. So these are the androgens. Abnormalities. So let's look at some abnormalities of the adrenal cortex.
Excuse me, Gary, aren't there some androgen-like substances that females make that are female hormones?
Well, if they're androgens, they really are not female hormones. Those are male hormones. That's why we call it. But it's very normal for the female to produce androgens in the adrenal cortex. And males do it too. It's just they don't have much of an effect in males because of the testosterone. But absolutely, you don't want to withdraw the hormones, the androgens from the female. They're important.
So they're called androgens even though they're made by females?
Absolutely. But because they are related to testosterone. Masculization of females. If there's a tumor in this area of the adrenal cortex, the female may become masculinized. They develop facial hair, larynx may enlarge. If there's a tumor in this area and it's still a fetus, the baby girl may be born with male genitalia. Even though her sex chromosomes are XX, she will have male genitalia because of the masculinization that has occurred from excess androgens. Another abnormality would be something called Addison's disease. If the adrenal cortex fails, this condition is called Addison's disease. There's an interesting side effect of Addison's disease. Think of the adrenal cortex not functioning normally. These people are going to have all the problems that one would expect. They're going to have problems with regulating sodium. They're going to have problems with handling stress. But they're also going to develop a dark pigmentation of their skin. Even though we said that melanocyte stimulating hormone normally does not affect skin color in humans, because the area near where ACTH is produced in the anterior pituitary is the area that produces melanocyte stimulating hormone, a loss of normal feedback from cortisol to the anterior pituitary causes excess stimulation, not just of ACTH, but also melanocyte stimulating hormone. And so here's this diagram, or these pictures they're trying to show. This is in a Caucasian patient. You can see the hyperpigmentation that has occurred.
Excuse me, Ms. Ford?
Yes?
I actually have a friend who's local here who has Addison's disease and didn't realize it until it was really, really late. And so she was saying really that she was like close to death, basically. How is that?
Yeah, well, again, you can't regulate electrolytes and you can't handle the stress. And those two things together can end up killing a person. John Kennedy had Addison's disease. So it's in severe form, if you can't regulate electrolytes and you can't handle stress, you'll die.
Yeah.
What causes it?
I'm sorry?
What causes it?
I think probably the cause is unknown. I suspect a tumor, but maybe there's other causes as well. I don't know. As far as I know, unknown causes. And finally here on this one, oops, that didn't go right. So, gosh, let's see if I got my, what happened to my Cushing? There we go. So here are two fraternal twins. obviously something very different going on here with the young girl than from the young man, right? A young boy. So in Cushing syndrome, there is excessive release of the cortisol from the adrenal cortex, and when that occurs, you end up with constant release of nutrients in the bloodstream, including adipose or triglycerides, and very commonly then fat begins to deposit in the body in a couple of areas. One in the face, so we get a typical kind of mooning appearance. Not shown here, but they also tend to develop adipose at the bottom of the neck on the back. So
What
this
does
would
that
be
look like? Is it like a hump, or is it?
a hump. Right.
This is Cushing syndrome?
Cushing syndrome from excess cortisol. All right, pancreas. So recall that your pancreas